Harry, it's your first time on. Nice to meet you, Harry. And yeah, what's your question? You might as well just pose it.
Oh yeah, so I can't tell. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Can you hear me
Sure.
okay? Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. This is just super fun. Um, I was wondering if you had any book recommendations or things to learn about this more because it's quite fascinating. My dad actually he worked at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory with some people and he dealt with some stuff. So if I could turn him on to this stuff, I don't think he's ever told me about it if he knew about it, but it would be cool to get his take on it. So that's my question, extended version, I suppose. So
Matt, do you want to take that?
Well, what I could do, let's compile a little reading list because I think that having some supplementary resources to accommodate this class or accompany this class will be great. So we'll pull together some PDFs that we could find, maybe some secondary videos, and make that as a list on the YouTube video description box. And then I'll make sure that you get those as well to just keep this going.
sweet, that would be perfect. Thanks.
Satomi. Yes.
I was wondering, what those fusion fission or fusion torch kind of explanation that Cynthia was giving. I'd like to know who she was saying she was getting this information from, because I think we have to kind of listen to some of his lectures too, because I know it's so much information. It's just kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's Jason Ross, and I'll include some relevant links of his, and All the Worlds of Mine on YouTube is the one that goes through the fusion plasma torch in a very clear and precise manner. But Jason Ross has done a lot of videos, so I'll include a few and you can find the rest, but there's like a plethora on YouTube.
Yeah, just some because yeah, I do know some, I was part of the green movement, and I'm right now in contact with this person that's the director of Be the Change Earth Alliance, and it's good to have these videos should a conversation come up, because he's very concerned about, of course he gets his information from the mainstream, and so it'd be good to let him know the alternatives. I'm not saying they're wrong or anything, but there are other alternatives that scientists are coming up with too.
Yeah, and Pandora's Promise is the documentary that goes over the Geiger meters, and they bring up a lot of other interesting points. So we'll probably include this in an email because I think that people might want more videos than we should put in the description box, but there's a lot of evidence to show, that there's really not any disadvantages to nuclear energy compared, to the other sources that we have. Like it's pretty much a win-win situation. And the concerns for waste and all that, if we build breeder reactors, it's really not an issue. So
yeah, I mean, it's amazing, really. It's kind of sad that we're so misinformed.
Yeah. And part of this is it's just so dirty when you start looking at some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes of the politics of science, and how we're told always there's we just can't do breeder reactors. We tried in the 70s, didn't work. Now we just don't do that. And it's like, well, it seems like there was actually a lot of sabotage where it's almost like you're telling somebody to run a race, but beforehand you like break their kneecaps, and then when they're just crawling and they're not doing very well, you're like, oh, see, I told you they couldn't run the race. So there's just so much artificial sabotage put in our path. Jerry, did you have a question?
And they're teaching it at the schools, like Be the Change. They go into all the schools and they teach this, CO2 is bad. And so it's just sort of good, I can't ever tell them it's bad or anything, but give them other alternatives to get them to start thinking. I think that's really what we have.
I think one way to approach it philosophically so that it's not a fight over like dogma or what would be perceived as a dogma, is just that there's no such thing as waste. There's only like resources that we haven't figured out ways to use, or which waste is one of them. And once we figure out ways to use them, they become resources again. And again, with a fusion economy, that very clearly changes everything. But you see with how we progressed with human civilization, things that we didn't know how to use, like uranium, was nothing, you know? And now that we have a way to use uranium, it changes the living standard of our societies greatly. So it's all relative, right? Based off of what is your level of understanding, what is your level of relationship to nature. It's actually not a form of corruption. It's actually understanding and wielding the full potential of nature in a responsible manner. And you're not going to run out of things. Stephen has actually had a question for a while.
Oh, did he? I totally missed that. I'm sorry. Stephen, go for it.
Thank you. Two-part question. First of all, how can you hear me? Because I'm using my built-in microphone.
Oh, good.
Okay, great. So the first part of my question goes back to your earlier in your lecture with the classic limits to growth Malthusian graph of the crisis point where we run out of resources because the Earth's population is growing too large. Have you, Cynthia, or has Rising Tide come across a differential equation called, I think it's the logistics function? Because there are differential equations that map out population growth. And when you look at the human population growth, it's mathematically determined that it will reach a limiting value of around 12.5 billion in another 50 or 100 years. So it kind of looks like an S curve that flattens out as it approaches time expanding on the right, if you will. So has anyone ever thought to counter the classic Malthusian thing with basic differential equations? Because the argument's mathematically garbage on the part of Malthusians.
Do you want to answer it, Matt, and I can add?
Yeah, I mean, I could say something to it. I mean, I think that the problem with the current language that's being used by these Club of Rome models, the mathematics that they're utilizing, is very much based upon a certain extrapolation of linear functions. So they just take what exists now and they can't infuse any, and you know that, yeah, you know this, we talked about this a lot, right? They can't infuse new qualities of ideas that have never existed before, because the computer model is all about just putting in by, you know, it's limited by what the programmer knows about the reality that they live in. They can't predict undiscovered discoveries in the future. And so it becomes a bit of a Pygmalion manifest. You know, like they create a Pygmalion effect by saying, well, by the linear rate of decrease of the resources that we're utilizing based upon the increased rates of population growth and consumption patterns, we can forecast these crises like Cynthia went through, the Malthusian trap. But what then happens is that they say, well, because the new science and technologies are not in our forecast, they're not in our computer models, we have to then prevent them from happening so that our computer model remains true, right? And it becomes this, again, Pygmalion effect. You're forcing reality to obey the model, the mathematical model, rather than forcing your model to obey reality, which is the way it should be. And there's never going to be a mathematical language that will ever be finished. It's always going to change according to every new discovery that we make, right? And we have to have that flexible idea. And as far as your population growth thing, I don't think populations are ever going to cap off at any point, because we're, you know, the idea of like Cynthia was saying, we're not really bounded by a closed system of the Earth. We're always able to think about the solar system, the other planets that we can terraform. Like, there's no reason to think that there's an absolute limit. I don't know, if, Cynthia, you think that, how you take that, or would you take that further and add to that, or?
No, I mean, the thing is that we're not even near that point. And obviously, you know, as we make further discoveries, because it's going to go past fusion power, there's there's the whole matter, antimatter discussion and all of this. Like, we can't predict too far into the future without, knowing how those types of revolutions are going to affect us. But already with the fusion revolution, our future for the next 100 years is going to be completely changed from how we thought it was going to be. Like the time of Thomas Malthus, imagine, there's no concept of a fusion economy. And now it's like the sky really is the limit. I mean, it's past the sky. The solar system is the limit with fusion power. So I think that we need to focus less on like searching for when is the negativity going to happen. Like, I think a lot of us have been trained to just look for the bad. I know for me, I've been trained so thoroughly on this that when I watch like a movie and things look too happy in a movie, I'm like, something bad is going to happen. I know it. And oftentimes it does. Like, it's a formula that we have, and we've been conditioned for this, that whatever is sold to us as like too good to be true, it is too good to be true. There's no such thing in our world anymore. But if we are to look at these things in a responsible, thorough manner, there really is not an argument for why we shouldn't have fission power, and there isn't an argument for why we shouldn't have fusion power. And even by the mainstream charts, okay, they show that nuclear energy is among the safest, if not the safest. So we need to just be positive. We need to be focused on being optimists of our lifetimes and think about how we can be positive for the future generations. And the future generations are going to add on to that. But we already know from what was discussed in this lecture that we're good. We're good. We don't have to be worried about leaving the world in a worse place if we make these types of transfers. If we instead shut down all of our nuclear plants and we rely on inefficient energy resources, we will have a collapse of those economies. As we see in Europe, it's a really horrible situation where there might be people who die this winter in supposedly first world countries because they don't have access to basic needs. And food production is also predicted to go down because you need energy to produce food, So it's a real disaster, and it's completely avoidable. And again, China is a very good role model in terms of how we should be modeling and organizing ourselves for the future. And there isn't a zero-sum game at this point. There aren't limited resources. There are not going to be wars in the future on limited resources. Wars have always been conducted to benefit a small grouping of people. And it's a fraud. The general population needs to figure this out. That it's not in anyone's interest to do this. It's not necessary. It's a fraud. So if we focus ourselves on the actual solutions, these types of frauds are going to not really have anywhere to go, because the answers are there. We just have to be clear and calm about it and do your research. Don't take my word for it, but look into the things that I've shown. We'll include links in the description box as well to go over things in more detail. But even official graphs concur with the information that I presented. So if that's the case, there's no justification for why there are people who are starving, who have lack of water, who have lack of sanitation, electricity. There's no reason for these things.
So we have time, I think, there's 3 questions in the queue. Jerry's been waiting for a while, so Jerry, go for it.
Okay. Well, Cynthia, you kind of answered it, but I'll ask it anyway. I really like the way you showed that computer model from 1973, that old clunker. And no matter what they did to change the inputs, they always got the same answer. It was like the thing was rigged, you know. But it's like, if you believe that crap, that nonsense from that 73 computer, you'd really have a pessimistic outlook of the world.
Mhm.
And you could see how you could develop this eugenics nonsense among that outlook, right?
Mhm.
If we got limited resources and limited energy, there's only room for so many people. Hey, you know, let's get rid of the undesirables for the rest of us, right?
Well, that's what Thomas Malthus promoted. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But, you know, looking at your diagrams and charts, it gives the opposite, that, you know, if we develop fusion, where we really, and the Chinese want to have a working one by 2040, and I think they're going to get one. I hope so anyway.
Mhm.
But if we develop fusion, we would have really no limits to the amount of energy per person we could produce, and no limits to the resources. And so now, wouldn't that completely change a person's outlook growing up in that kind of a society, as opposed to this crazy 1973 limits to growth? I think it would, but you kind of answered it. But yeah, don't you think that would change how people would think?
Well, there was a survey, right, that was done comparing, I believe it was, Matt, it was the United States and it was China, right? Where they were saying like what they had, like a, you know, 6 choices or whatever. And they asked like, you know, teenagers, and I think, you know, children like around the 12-year-old mark or so, what they wanted to be when they grow up. And, you know, you had the choice of like YouTuber, right? And then you had a choice of being a taikonaut. They say taikonaut? I keep forgetting.
I mean, astronaut is, yeah,
Whatever,
you want to be a
astronaut.
star or
And
an
so
engineer, and they had 10 jobs. Yeah, astronaut was one of them.
yeah, and in the United States, the top pick was YouTuber, and in China, it was astronaut, I believe. So it just goes to show that the level of imagination, your creative imagination, is obviously going to be much larger if you think that you have a positive future where you can influence things for the good. In the world that we're growing up in, increasingly in the West, we are told that, you know, you have to, it's like social Darwinism, and you know, you just have to go after fame and fortune. Those are the the idols that the youth are worshiping right now, rather than truth, knowledge, beauty, and harmony, right? There is almost a disbelief that we can live in a harmonious way at all in the West. And of course, that causes a massive spiritual dissonance in people. And there's a lot of psychiatric issues that are rising in the West, specifically because of this. Depression and suicide rates are off the charts. Drug use is off the charts. It's very clear. Our civilization, with our approach to things, is killing the minds of our youth, especially, which is the future, but everybody. There's just the older generations are also not much of a role model in terms of positivity, and that that's because of a lot of social engineering that happened, unfortunately, in their generations. And so the mind is really, I forgot to make that a point actually in my class, the mind is really the limit to growth. What you choose to cap in terms of your creativity, in terms of your imagination, is going to determine what your future is. It's not a game theory model, because if you're truly a superior creative mind, you will not be held boxed into a game theory type thing. You know, it's like a monkey trap. You don't need to follow artificial rules that are not bounded by the universe. That's what a slave does. So as when we learn to think for ourselves in a way that is truly sovereign, which is truly lawful, and it's harmonious, it's creative, it's good. We understand that we're good. We actually are the most empowered to change our lives and the future generations for the best. But if you live in a system of oligarchy, they're obviously not going to want that sort of empowerment in the population. So all I can say is thank God for China, because it would be much more depressing if it wasn't for China.
Nazgat is just asking about the pictographs of the banana radiation and others shown. So maybe we could find a way to maybe make your PowerPoint available. I know there's a lot of valuable infographics that you use. So
yeah, I can share it in an email with some of the links to the presentations as well for people.
Yeah, that sounds good. Paula has had some thoughts. Yeah, Paula, why don't you share the kernel of your idea?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me with a simple internal microphone? I said, okay, thank you. In the past, before, so to speak, discovering different ways of thinking about history, which I must admit, it came into my life quite late. So I've been living in this sort of bubble for many, many years. As part of these many, many years, there has been some exposure to justement limits to growth. And one of its initiators, which is a woman called Donna Meadow. And Donna Meadow, excuse me, the first thing I want to say is that limits to growth has always been considered for what it is in isolation, but I want to say that this is part of a much larger production of work which intended to model how organizations often get themselves in situations where the problem they try to solve, not only they don't solve them, but by the solution they adopt, they don't solve the problem and they create other problems worse than the problem they want to solve. Mm-hmm. So in fact, I must say that this principle, so-called systemic thinking, is what woke me up with this crisis. When they started to implement all of these draconian measures, mm-hmm. including lockdown, I said, this is very anti-systemic because, etc. Mm-hmm. And so Donna Meadow, I must say, there's been one of my fari, within one of my light. And it seems to me that what she was trying to achieve, as well as other people in her entourage, was rather to open up an awareness of how often, big major organization or even public, public health, etc. They do come up with solutions that might be seemingly acceptable in the short term. Sorry about the lighting. In the short term, but not really very interesting, so to speak. They wouldn't really address the problem. So another archetypes. This is part of it. Like I said, about 10 archetypes. Another one was the success to the successful, for example, etc. So sorry about that. I'm making this a bit too long. So, but my comment and question, if you wish, was to, first of all, is anybody aware, or do you know about Donna Meadow? Do you think that she was also an eugenist? Because she doesn't strike me as being that at all. And then the final point is, maybe in some of these intellectuals in history have been somewhat not misused, but used by the oligarchy, by big powers and turn their message to what fitted the oligarchy rather than what fitted the people themselves, the people making these statements. So I apologize for being this long.
Do you know who the Donna person is, Matt? He's like the encyclopedia. If he,
no, yeah. I mean, but you actually do know. You just forgot. This is one of the two people who was in charge with Jay Forrester of building the limits to growth MIT model that was featured there, right? Yeah, I don't think that Donella is necessarily in on it. You know, like I don't think that she's in any way one of the higher controllers of the system that she was used to advance. As are most people you'll find who find themselves playing a certain role. They're not aware of what the role is. It's just that their minds have been conditioned and wired in a certain way that makes them useful tools. I think the thing that people like Meadows and Forrester and Alexander King and Aurelio Pichai, they were all big in the 1950s. There was a new field of science that came out, which you referred to, called problematique. And the idea was that science, the old wisdom of what science was defined by for many generations had to change, because people used to think, this is the way that they're talking, right? Science solves problems. That's why science exists, to make things better, to improve things. That's the old wisdom. That's the obsolete way of thinking of science. We need a new way. And the problematique crowd, and they were all part of it. This is actually a really big deal. They said, no, the actual, every time you solve a problem, it creates more problems. So it became increasingly a way to mentally castrate yourself, because every time, every new discovery became the cause of greater problems. And so the source of solving problems became stopping the solution, stopping the creative discoveries to begin with. And that will preemptively stop the worst crises from happening, which became, again, that self-fulfilling prophecy problem. So when you have people like Alexander King saying, you know, his famous quote from his 1991 assessment of the limits to growth and the Club of Rome's progress in 1991, what was it called? Oh, I forget the name of the book now, but in that book, he makes that famous quote saying, you know, we were trying to figure out, when we were planning and building our models, what would unite humanity, pollution, you know, this, he has like a bunch of variables, and he says, ultimately, we found out that the common denominator amongst all these different variables was humanity's desire for improvement. And so thus we realized that the big enemy then that unites us is humanity itself. And we had something to work with. So that's really what they're getting at. It's sick, but that's the thing. So they created a system of consistent logic that brought them to, anybody who falls into that system of thinking will come to the same conclusions, thinking that it was their own mind making the so-called discoveries along the way. And they don't realize that the whole game was rigged. It's like playing a board game, you know? After you play a game of Monopoly, you could be 4 people, but by the end of the game of Monopoly, you'll always arrive at the same place where there won't be many winners. There'll be one winner, right? And you could have taken various paths to get there, but it was all built into the rules of the game. Just don't play by the rules. If you play by the rules, you'll have the same outcome. Yeah. Problematic. The problematic way of thinking.
By the way, Harry has to share how his video is so high quality, because Luke is the only other person we know, and he's invested a lot in that. So if you have a cheaper version, that would be great.
Oh, my video. I don't know. I just somehow blurred out the background for my school Zooms, and then I guess it just makes it more in focus, but that's all I got going on. I don't know. I'm not magical.
Okay. All right.
Could be the computer. Probably not me.
Oh, it's in Zoom. You can do that.
Oh, Zoom. Okay.
Oh, and Zoom.
All right, we have to get more experimental. We're not.
Yeah.
Our creative power.
Oh, you guys aren't in Zoom. I see.
No, we are. We're just not exploring
Okay.
Zoom's potentials well enough.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's all good. That's all cool.
We've created limits to the potentials of Zoom.
I think that's
all right.
a good place to stop. Hey?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to stop. And it's 6 o'clock now. This is rounding it out very nicely. There's a lot of ideas that have just been raised that have to really be worked on and made your own. Magdalena is asking, does anybody know how the Club of Rome came to be? Yeah, it's a whole other thing. Not even a whole other thing. Club of Rome, that was, I'm trying to figure out the most efficient way of saying that. Do you have an efficient way, Cynthia, of saying that? I could say something, but I don't want to ramble on.
I'm gonna make a bad joke. No, I don't.
Well, you just got to look at Alexander King and Aurelio Pichai. Okay, the key is those two guys who founded it, because if you look at what they were doing after World War II, Sir Alexander King was he headed the scientific directorate of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. His function was to bring in systems analysis and cybernetics into the new management structures of the OECD that did a lot of education reforms across the the Allied countries after World War II during the Cold War, and also into NATO, which became an early adopter of systems analysis for its internal governing departments. It's basically a hyper compartmentalized way of organizing a system where no department knows what the other department really needs to do, and you just hyper specialize in an overinflated bureaucracy. And then you just have a couple of people that you need to control certain nodes that can see the whole. Most people don't. They just don't know. They don't have the mind's infrastructure to understand a whole. So it's a great way to keep a machine moving without the parts knowing what the design is all about. Yeah, and so from there, then you can sort of map out what he was doing when he created the Club of Rome, and who was funding that, and also what he was doing with Klaus Schwab, in the early 70s, like Cynthia went through with the World Economic Forum. But yeah. All that to say, there's going to be a lot of follow-up, a lot of homework. We will include a lot of resources in the description box for people to follow up on. Next week, we will have a presentation by Dr. Michael Claridge, the lead scientist at the Sapphire Project, that's been working on non-standard theory approaches to the plasma universe, to building up systems in labs that are actually producing incredible results of transmutation in environments that should not, by the accepted mainstream physics, be able to produce the results that he's been getting. But that won't be the topic of his presentation. He's going to go into some metaphysics, some metaphysical implications to some of his research that'll deal with. I'm not even going to say. I'm just going to let people come. So that'll be next Sunday at 2 p.m. We're going to follow that up with a class on Pythagoras, the Pythagorean method that was crushed many, many, many centuries, millennia ago, and the fight to revive it. And maybe we'll have some special surprises as well. So that'll be next Sunday at 2 p.m. Cynthia, do you have any last parting thoughts for people?
Nope.
Okay. All right, guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again this week.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.